All right.
My name is Beth. I think we are welcoming to people who are like us. I don't think we know what it looks like to be welcoming to others.
Because we haven't had the opportunity. Interesting. All right.
Jennifer, my name is Jennifer. I'm going to say yes, because the church has welcomed me and my family. Yes, I do look like most of the other people in this church, but it's also accepted where I've been at and my progress in myself becoming welcoming. And this church has had a huge impact on my own beliefs and challenging my own beliefs and progressing in that area. So there's always work to be done, but I believe it's welcoming.
Appreciate that. One of the things that when we answer questions about welcome and when we think about the idea of new people coming to the church is we often sort of think there's us and there's them, and does them fit with us and how do we treat them, as though nobody ever changes. When in fact, the moment the them becomes part of the us is now different. And the them is going to be different. And so this is a constantly fluid and evolving question. So I appreciate it's different now than it was 11 years ago. Of course it is. And in fact, it will be different 6 months from now than it is today. We have to keep asking ourselves these questions. Who are we? What are we doing? How are we welcome? I'm gonna put Joel up on the last.
Go
for it, Joe.
I'm John, and I think we're welcoming to the degree that we have the opportunity, and yet it forces us to get out of our comfort zone.
Okay. Interesting. Good. Barbara?
I'm Barbara.
Barbara, you looked great on TV yesterday. I just want to say. You did wonderful.
I personally found Covenant not only welcoming, but a family. I came to a church where people had known each other since kindergarten. And I came with I was a caregiver for my husband for 10 years. And I feel like I not only was welcome, but I became part of the family. So from my standpoint, Covenant could not have been more welcome.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Cora. I think that question isn't totally clear to me because what is a welcoming church?
Good. Challenge the question. Excellent.
I just feel like, yeah, we're welcoming, we're happy with each other, and I love how this church is growing. I agree with Beth. I think that we don't know how to grow necessarily, and our leadership now, and our leadership with Katie and Tracy has helped us tremendously to open the doors further. Who said about that clear door? Was that you, my darling?
Yes,
it
it
was. Yeah, that was a really good one too. Yeah.
I really appreciate your challenging or asking more, saying, I don't know what this question means. Because the word welcome, and I talked about this a little bit yesterday, is sometimes a little bit of a problematic word. It doesn't, on its surface, necessarily mean very much. Of course everyone's welcome. Like, it's not a closed club. I mean, you let people in the doors. But is that really welcoming them? John said it's welcoming to the degree that we have the opportunity. So that seems to suggest that the measure of whether a church is welcoming is what happens when someone actually shows up of their own accord. If they happen to stumble in your door, do you welcome them? Yes. But is that welcome? Is that enough to be considered a welcoming church? The other complication of the term, and I've hinted at it by putting these other questions, I asked, do you belong to a welcoming church? And most of you are answering the question, is Covenant Presbyterian Church a welcoming congregation? Which is fine, that's the church you're most familiar with day to day. But that isn't the only church you are part of. You are part of the Presbyterian Church USA. You are part of the Presbytery of Scioto Valley. You are part of the Church of Jesus Christ in the world. Are you part of a welcoming church? And depending on the moment, and depending on who you're talking about, and depending on which of those levels of inclusion you're talking about, the answer might be different. And that's worth reflecting on too, because when people who maybe have been oppressed or excluded are looking for a place to feel safe and included, Covenant Presbyterian Church may not be what they are assessing in their mind in making a decision whether to come here. It might be Christians, and the answer is no.
Maybe yes.
And it might be yes. But you don't get to control completely their experience of what they think they're joining, what they think they're walking into.
Terry, for me personally, I see Covenant is very welcoming. I mean, I feel loved and surrounded, and I agree with Barbara. This is part of my family. I'm not sure, though, if I were a stranger coming in, somebody, I would feel we were friendly, but I don't know that they would feel we were welcoming.
That's an interesting distinction. Very good.
I kind of agree with John that we're welcoming if they walk in the door. We live in an area, take Arlington, Dublin, Hilliard, Grandview Heights. We're all about 85% European looking. I don't see that our church has ever made much of an effort to go out and encourage people who look different to come to our church. When I mention, just when people say, you know, if I say, well, our church is doing something, well, what church do you belong? Covenant Presbyterian Church. The comment I've heard repeatedly, oh, that's the music church. No, I think that's what.
Which can attract a lot of people to a church, intentionally. But are they welcome when they arrive?
But we've also had efforts that say, if you stand up after service and turn around and don't know someone, please go and introduce yourself. And I think we've been re-energized to do that multiple times.
Great.
My wife kind of took up all the time for this.
She left a little bit for you.
I guess when I think about this church, I think about my personal experience, and I get one sentence in. So, if you look at all the LGBTQ, I've worked with all these people. They were my patients, families, the grandparents, the second set of marriages. I got along with everyone. Those people that I know, and they're from Africa, they're from Nepal, they're here, there, everywhere. I would welcome all of them here. I'm not sure everybody.
But do you belong to a welcoming church?
I think within the family of white people, the answer is yes.
It's a very telling answer and an honest one. I appreciate it. We are answering the question, do you belong to a welcoming church?
Everyone has answered.
I belong to a welcoming church at one sentence.
Yes, you don't get to hear what anyone else said or what I've said about their answers. You just have to answer.
Yes, I do feel that I belong to a welcoming church, and that's my choice because I've been in a church as a great deal. So I don't know if that's a legitimate way of answering.
Very good. Thank you. And now Joel gets to go last. Hey, Pastor Joel, do you belong to a welcoming church?
I'm going to base this on what I learned at your workshop yesterday, that we should be rejecting binaries.
Okay.
So it's not a yes or no question.
Tricky.
Or if we want to really answer, the answer is yes and no. And it depends on who we talk to. It depends on who we're looking at.
Welcoming, what's that?
Can I pick up on that, the binary issue
Sure.
you picked up from yesterday? Because to me, living in a universe that isn't binary is to me like black and white, good, bad. It's like the thin places that the Irish, the thin spots that the Irish talk
Yes.
about with God.
Liminal
And-
space.
And to me, it's where grace lives. It's where forgiveness lives. I would say that this was in the sort of gray spots, because it's not black or white. It's where it happens. So,
Thank you. Welcoming of whom is often the question. Usually when people say yes, it's a welcoming place. It's because they were welcome. And why would you not answer that? That's our best way of knowing. But the challenge is to step outside of ourselves and assess further the nature and the completeness of our I want to empower the word welcome. I want it to be more than the word we print on a map we walk on. I want it to be something that takes effort and has substance and actually can change people's lives and itself proclaim the good news of Jesus Christ. So the journey that the Presbyterian Church has been on of welcome, and I gave a very abbreviated version of this yesterday. As one, I think we could characterize it as a lot of years of being de facto not welcoming, and then enshrining our unwelcome in policy, and then walking back from that, from a policy standpoint. I shared yesterday that they appointed a task force in the late 1970s, both the northern and southern churches did. They adopted language that said self-avowed practicing homosexuals could not be ordained. They were trying to focus on people's behavior rather than their identity, which was, of course, a misunderstanding and something that we don't ask of heterosexuals, to separate their sexuality from the rest of who they are that way. They also were trying to focus on self-avowed, which at the time felt like they were trying to say, don't go on witch hunts. This is only for people who are making it an issue. But the effect was to essentially tell people to suppress honesty about themselves. Say, it was don't ask, don't tell. It's okay for you to be gay, just don't talk about it. And that was probably more damaging than if they had even said don't be gay. It created a culture in the church of inauthenticity, a culture of telling people to not be honest with themselves and with each other about who they were and are. Even though that was 1978, coming up on 45 years, I think that culture still prevails in a lot of the church. Even as society opens, the vestiges of that, please don't make a stir with your sexuality, still exists, even in progressive Presbyterian churches, because they're full of nice people who don't want things to be bumpy or conflicted or controversial. Even progressive churches. The church also took a position on marriage. It wasn't really intending to be so exclusive in 1983 because there wasn't such a thing as same-sex marriage in the US in 1983. But the language they adopted that specifically mentioned a woman and a man became the barrier to changing church policy. It was in the Book of Order, and so it required a vote to change it, even when states and courts began to affirm same-sex marriage. As the church started to wrestle with this, and having not really ever, as in fact a couple of presbyteries did ordain openly LGBTQ people because it wasn't prohibited in the Book of Order. This was just a policy statement. A group of conservatives in the church actually adopted and put together an effort to add language to the Book of Order. And that's what came to be called Amendment B, or G60106B. Among the requirements for ordination is fidelity in marriage between a man and a woman, or chastity in singleness. And that was a particularly curious construction, by the way. It somehow managed to be about homosexuality without using the word homosexuality. They never applied it to anyone other than LGBTQ people. It framed it in positive values. Who can argue with fidelity as something we should value? And yet it was really all about exclusion. And chastity was a particularly interesting choice. We had never said chastity as our, it was a very ancient sort of word to put in the Book of Order. They seemed to mean celibacy. But they used the word chastity, which Calvin talked about chastity, and he talked about it in spiritual terms. It was a commitment of the heart. It wasn't about behavior at all. I mean, I would have liked to have seen more trials where the person was actually accused of unchastity and heard some theological debates over whether they were chaste in their heart. while they were having sex. This was an odd construction. And then the really odd part of it was persons refusing to repent of what the confessions call sin shall not be ordained. As I said yesterday, the Book of Confessions, which has the Nicene Creed and the Apostles' Creed, has the Westminster Confession of Faith from the 1630s, has the Scots Confession from 1561. The language of the Book of Confessions really has a lot of sins listed in it, like women performing baptisms, like gluttony, like lending money at interest. We have been ordaining people who do things the confessions call sin for quite some time. In fact, we've been very proud of it on some occasions. So this was a problem. They'd overstepped. There it was. The church kept trying to remove it in the General Assembly in 97 and in 2001 and 2008 voted to get rid of it, but the Presbyterians didn't go along. It wasn't until 2010's assembly, and the Presbyterians in the year that followed, that they changed that language and changed the requirement for ordination to the council, so the presbytery for ministers or the session for elders and deacons, shall examine each candidate's calling, gifts, preparation, and suitability for the responsibilities of ordered ministry. It took the emphasis off of excluding categories of people and said, no, everyone gets examined, and they get examined based on their faith and their sense of call and their qualifications. And every person has to have an individual decision made about them, we're not even considering it.
That's an enormous change in 10 years.
For 15 years really, but yes, it is an enormous change. The Covenant Network, I will step in with a promotional word, the Covenant Network of Presbyterians was formed in 1997, the same when G60106B went in the Book of Order. And it was formed specifically to tackle that paragraph. And the founders of the Covenant Network thought that that would take a couple of years. They would throw some money at it, they would organize they didn't think they did a good job at the General Assembly where that passed. So they would put together a little more organized effort, and the church would undo it. That is not what happened. But what the Covenant Network did then was they realized this is a long-term effort. And it's not just an effort to win a vote at General Assembly. We have to create a different understanding in the church around sexuality. We have to give a theological foundation to why we would be inclusive of all people. They really, and this is before I was involved, I'm not taking credit, they gave the church a vocabulary for talking about sexuality that was different than the kind of Victorian way, chastity, that we had been using before. And they held national conferences. I think there was one in Columbus, if I'm not mistaken. There were publications, there were videos, there were books. They created, that it was a profound change, but it wasn't a magical change. It was a lot of hard work to really change how people thought, how people talked. Sermons changed in pulpits across America over time because of that work. And in the end, what they adopted was a deeply theological, a much more theologically sound paragraph than the one it replaced.
But it doesn't beg the question, what does suitability mean?
Well, you're right, and that actually emerges as the problem now, because suitability, it was by design, it wasn't an accident, but it still left presbyteries and sessions completely free to determine who was in and who was out. And honestly, I'm not sure I would have that any other way. I really don't want to take away the freedom. I don't want to mandate anyone be ordained. That the session has to decide that. The presbytery has to decide that. And yet at the same time, because that suitability is open to interpretation, we still have a church where our policy is local option. One presbytery can ordain LGBTQ people, and the one across the county line might not. And that's not hypothetical, that's how it actually is. We have, I was with a group of mid-council leaders, Presbyterian executives, last year, and I asked the group, I have an estimate that we have open, because there's no statistics on this, I have an estimate that there are openly LGBTQ people serving as pastors of churches in less than half of our presbyteries. And everyone in the room said to me, that's too high. Probably less than a third. It was about 40% of the ones in the room, and those were the people who had come to my workshop on this subject. So they were probably not even represented. They were probably overrepresented.
We have one.
You have
In
one.
Southern
So Southern Valley is willing to do it.
2 years ago.
I want you to think about what the experience of that one might be. And you start to get a sense of why even changing the policy, even getting people to vote yes, still hasn't solved the problem. When so many of our pastors already have struggled with isolation and loneliness or getting a job, now imagine being the only openly queer minister in your entire presbytery. We changed the policy in 2015 as well on marriage. Finally, the votes came to talk about marriage in terms other than a civil contract between a man and a woman. Sort of. The language we adopted was a unique commitment between two people, traditionally a man and a woman. General Assembly is a political body. And I will say it was a really powerful moment actually for me at the Assembly when this was approved, because 3 people went to the microphone to speak on it. First, there was a former moderator of More Light Presbyterians board, which is another one of the LGBT advocacy groups, and she went up there and she said, I don't like this traditionally a man and a woman language, but I support this because I believe by doing this we can keep the church together. And then a known conservative went to the microphone and said, I am not crazy about this decision, but I'm going to vote for it today because you've provided a way for me to be affirmed in my historic belief while also allowing the church to go forward. And by the time that debate ended, there was a relative sense of peace around this issue. And 71% of the General Assembly voted for it, and a 2/3 majority of Presbyterians voted for it. I think there will come a day where this language might get changed again, but this allowed the change to happen that needed to. Although it was still local option. Ministers are allowed to perform same-sex marriages. They're not required to. Sessions are allowed to authorize them in their church, but they're not required to. And in fact, churches can make policies that say we will not allow same-sex marriages in this church. That's still allowed under the Book of Mormon.
Can I ask you one question?
Yeah.
A church like this in Arlington, what percentage of the people in the church even know about this?
You would have to answer that question for me.
I was gonna say,
What
That's-
percentage of any church?
That's why I'm here. You're right. I think your point is well taken, and that's why we have to talk about it. In 28, I'm sorry.
But then, we're friends with a minister that went to Princeton probably about 20 years ago. He openly said a third of his class at Princeton were openly gay.
Princeton Seminary?
yes,
Well, I was there 23 years ago, and that's not true. In fact, that could not be less true.
I was on a search committee when Dr. Langford was here for the assistant pastor, and so I was on the phone doing interviews with people, and I asked that very question. That was Langford here, like 25, 27 years ago. And every single seminary we interviewed for came up with 30%.
Yeah, there were 150 students in my class who graduated in 1999 from Princeton. I think 4 of them were openly gay. So that's
Well,
just
but you could have had some that were not openly.
well, sure. Absolutely. And they had to be non-open because they couldn't have been ordained
Yeah.
if they were. And I was one of them. The student group at Princeton that supports LGBT students is called BClass, Bisexual Gay Lesbian Association of Seminary Students. And they, when I was there, they met at a secret location in time. You had to ask the secretary in the chapel office for the time and place of the meeting, because it wasn't safe. So they were definitely not that many openly gay students.
So has that changed?
Well, they don't have to meet in secret anymore. That has changed.
I graduated in 09, and it was better, but it's not what people think it is. People think that Princeton is this progressive, open-minded place. That has not been its history. That was not its founding.
No.
That has not been its history.
And it's
And
not
in
its
my
present.
experience 10 years ago, that was not its present.
It's not its present now. I mean, it reflects the Presbyterian Church. It is inclusive, but it is far from our most progressive seminary.
But you know why we point it, because then if you have a group of people, individuals, they're now ministers, they're working their way up the chain, how influential are they gonna be in the church itself as time goes on, as far as making doctrine and making statements?
Do you consider that a good thing?
Because it includes them in what the church is going to do and what their creeds and their statements are going to be. That's good.
One of the things that and we talked a little bit about this yesterday in the event. We sometimes think about this as making a distinction, whether we're trying to attract people or we're talking about the influence of ministers on the system, between LGBTQ people and straight, cisgender, heterosexual people. When in fact, I think the distinction in the church in terms of doctrine and in terms of who we're trying to welcome may depend less on the actual sexual orientation of the people today than it does on their willingness to be welcoming of LGBTQ people. Younger generations, time and again, when you look at the polls taken by like the Pew Center on Religion, younger people are choosing churches. Straight younger people, heterosexual young people, are choosing churches based on whether they are welcoming of their LGBTQ friends. That our identity will be determined, I think, not on whether we are gay or not, or whether we are transgender or not, but whether we are willing to be identified with, welcoming of, influenced by, one with the queer community.
Brian, is not, it was mentioned yesterday in the workshop, imagine 10% of the population is LGBTQIA, but there's the Washington Post earlier in this calendar year, number of that the number is closer to 30% now, and you're looking at people age 20 and younger.
Right. Are willing
Which shows we're moving into a very, very different world. So everything you said about, yes, cisgender straight young people choosing a church based on how welcoming we are to the queer community, yes, and the number of young people who self-identify as queer is growing exponentially.
Right. In all of its manifestations. Queerness in all of its manifestations.
We have a long way to go because the suicide rate is extremely high for young.
And this is one of the reasons I want to point out what the General Assembly did in 2018. You know, I think a lot of people thought, okay, finally we can check off ordination, we can check off marriage. It's local option, but at least we can do what we want to do. Some of us weren't quite satisfied that was enough. And so in 2018, I was part of a group that brought some resolutions to the Assembly that were both adopted. One that celebrates the gifts of people of diverse sexual orientations and gender identities. Nothing about those earlier actions celebrated anything. It made things okay if you have to. But in 2018, the Assembly approved this, affirming the gifts of LGBTQIA+ people and celebrating their service in the church, because remember, by then we'd had 7 years of ordaining openly. Affirming God's presence and call in the lives of all God's people and committing to seeking justice, equality, and inclusion for all in church and society. So that empowered not only our ordination to happen, but it called on our stated clerk and our other mission workers to work for justice in society for LGBTQ people. And encouraged all congregations and councils continually to seek to expand their welcome. So you, by inviting me here, are fulfilling a mandate the General Assembly gave you in 2018. And not just for its own sake, not just for, civil rights, not just for justice, so that all might know the good news of Jesus Christ. And encourages all other communions to do the same. So one of the things the Covenant Network is now involved in is supporting our world mission staff as they work with our partner churches around the world, or as our missionaries work in other countries, recognizing that many of those countries are engaging in the same conversations. Many of those churches are struggling through the same set of questions that our church has. How can we be of support to them? And how can they learn from our experience? Not in a colonial way, but in a way that is affirming of their context, recognizing that we are all partners in this. We are one church. The other resolution in 2018 dealt specifically with transgender and non-binary people. And the church affirmed the full dignity and the full humanity of transgender people, their full inclusion in all human rights, and their giftedness for service. Our church had never before 2018 taken any position on transgender or gender non-binary people. And actually, I think that's the bigger issue in many ways for the church right now. We debated LGBT people because that was an issue where we could vote on their ordination or their non-ordination, their marriage or not marriage. But when we're not debating polity, we Presbyterians sometimes don't know how to have a conversation. And there was nothing to debate with transgender people. They were never excluded from ministry. And there were no rules against being transgender. But they were suffering for their invisibility in the church. And when people in the church started to talk about gender identity, it was not always in affirming ways. Certainly outside of the Presbyterian Church, as we speak, churches are speaking of transgender and gender non-binary people in very non-affirming ways. What do you think is fueling the legislation in many state legislatures right now that is just trying to be hateful toward transgender people? And so we took this stand as our first statement, calling on everyone to expand their welcome. We also made very practical suggestions. So we called on churches to adopt welcoming statements. I'm sorry, that's way too small to read back there. But welcoming statements that specifically name transgender and gender non-binary people. So don't just say all are welcome. Say transgender and gender non-binary people are welcome here. Available facilities, bathrooms that acknowledge those who may not be male or female, and in which people who identify as female but maybe were of male sex previously are welcome. Think about our worship and our liturgy and our hymns, language that's inclusive of everyone. And of course, respecting people's pronouns and the names that they ask us to use. Sorry.
21 years that there was this turnaround, which is incredibly rapid. I mean, it's wonderful to see that, but you look historically how short a period of 21, that's within our lifetimes. I mean, I'm sure that every single one of us here has changed in accordance with this. We have changed. Our generation of adults has changed across time over the past 30, 40 years. And it's nice to see that affirmed. And we've been a part of that generation, and it's been a special generation where this has happened.
So I know we need to wrap it, but it would be nice to end on that positive note, but instead I'm going to end on reality. Because you're right, it has changed rapidly. But how much has it changed? We've changed our policies. We've taken good votes. But here's the reality. Local option, we talked about that. It's not required. And there are still a lot of places where it's not happening, that people are being fully included. There are policies against it. The ministers who are out often serve in isolation. They often have trouble getting jobs. And it's much harder to find a call. And, This is still an issue for women in ministry. And we've been ordaining women for nearly 70 years in the PCUSA. We have a long way to go for LGBTQ people to be equal. So obviously I didn't plan for a 45-minute class very well. Let me tell you about the Covenant Network of Presbyterians. We are engaged now in work like I'm doing here with you all, education and engagement, offering resources and training. I try to do this in churches all over the country, sometimes in person, sometimes online. This is what churches that get involved with supporting our work are making possible. It's mission, it's ministry, and I'm grateful for churches that join us. We do some advocacy and activism. We don't have to fight at every General Assembly like we used to, but there still are issues, and I have every fear that they will get worse, that just like in the broader nation, there will be retrenchment, there will be pushback, because there always is, and fear, and people who had power have lost something, and so there's going to be efforts to get it back. Connection and community. We are really trying through events that we call Covenant Conversations to bring churches together so that a church like Covenant is able to connect with other congregations in your presbytery and even around the country who are in similar places, trying to work through the same issues. It can be a resource to each other. And then access. I am often the pastor on call for candidates for ministry and ministers and presbytery executives who are facing a challenge. Sometimes a pastoral challenge, they're in need, in crisis, they're being discriminated against. Sometimes they have a polity problem they need some help solving. Sometimes they just need to know where to find the resource they're looking for. What I do often is take those calls, take those emails, and try to point people in the right direction. If you have other questions, this doesn't have to be the end of the conversation. There's my email address and our website, phone number. I have some brochures that are in my bag, which I left over here, I think, that I invite you to take on the way out with a little more information about the Covenant Network. And I also have some envelopes for those who want to make a financial contribution. You are welcome to do that, no pressure, but it does allow these sorts of events to go on. So I'm grateful for the time. I'm sorry to have to wrap up so quickly at the end, but thank you for being here.
So are you recommending that, like, instead of just saying we're a welcoming church, be even more specific in our statement?
I think a church that wants, I also have a sign-up sheet if anyone wants to be on, to get future communications from us. I don't have a pen for the sign-up sheet, but thank you. I'm going to put that over here, along with envelopes and brochures.
Those of you who are serving communion, let's go in and do blocking for that right away.
And to answer the question about welcoming statements, an LGBTQIA+ person who sees an all are welcome kind of statement doesn't think you really mean that.
That's why I'm saying, well, here's a question from the beginning. I teach at college, and it's just, that's an old word
And
almost.
I don't mean to say you're not sincere in saying it. I mean to say that queer people who've been hurt by the church aren't ready to necessarily take that word unless it's specifically references.
I need to take it.
Oh, I'm sorry.
It's fine, just let you know. You can take it.
Very, very interesting. And I remember when we sermon in Pastor Street, I always look for a married one with children because they be safe. And yet, we have too close relationships that we from their children and homosexual relationships as in marriage. I mean, our daughter-in-law, 18 years of marriage, she's down that her wife is Jennifer. And we love her dearly.
I'm sorry.
Leave that here.
She's Sally's
Go, okay?
principal. She's Sally's
Let's
principal.
go block out communion.
I've gotten to know her really well because my daughter had a incident at the playground.
Here we go.
Yeah, she is. I'm glad. Enjoy her.
And she has syndicated sermons for all of her.
Thank you.
Thank Thank
You wanna
you.
put both of our names down?
No.
Just me?
Or you
Well, you'll get it.
I'm gonna go get a half a cup of coffee.